Hi, Misha here, and in this two-part video I'm going to go over the torpedo bombers and dive bombers used by America in the Pacific in World War II. To that end, over here we have the TBD Devastator, and in no particular order, next we have on the table the SBD Helldiver. Then next up we have the SBD Dauntless. And then finally we have the TBF or TBM Avenger. So yeah, in part 1 we will look at the early planes, and in part 2 we'll look at what replaced them. And it's kind of interesting. In one category, many might say there was an improvement made. In the other category, some might argue maybe there wasn't an improvement. But anyway, we'll get into some of the specs and a little bit of history and talk about these models. Well, let's get to it. Well, to start us off, we'll start at pretty much the beginning, at least of the modern era for naval-based bombers. This is the Douglas Torpedo Bomber Douglas, TBD. Really only there was the -1, there were a few minor differences in versions, but yeah, this, as you'll see, wasn't in production long enough to have major updates. This is known as the Devastator, but actually this name was not applied until 1941. And this dates back to 1934, when the U.S. Navy ordered development or put out tenders for a new torpedo bomber to be modern, is carrier based. And the following year in April, Douglas flew the prototype of this, entered it into trials, and actually it went through trials very quickly, no real issues, and then it was carrier tested on the USS Lexington. It passed all of that, and it started to go into U.S. Navy service in 1937. When this was adopted, it was a very modern, one of the most modern carrier-based planes, and probably the most modern carrier-based bomber in the world. As you see, it is a monoplane. It has a fully enclosed cockpit. It's a metal plane, so no canvas or wood. Kind of funny to think of that as being a modern feature today, but back in the 30s it was. It had powered wings for folding and unfolding. It had retractable landing gear. Well, sort of. There's kind of semi-recessed, semi-retractable. As is often repeated, they do stick out a bit. This was in case there was a failure, they could give something to kind of sort of land on. This had a crew of 3. You had your pilot, you had your bombardier, who also would work as a navigator, and you had your gunner in the back, who would also work as a radio man. Defensive armaments. We had one .30 caliber machine gun in the back, and initially in the front we had a second .30 caliber machine gun in the fuselage. Later versions may have a .50 caliber put in its place, though, to slightly increase things. For offensive weaponry, this is a torpedo bomber, so it has a torpedo, about a 1900 pounder. It's the Mark 13 torpedo. It could, instead of carrying the torpedo under the body, it could carry a 1,000-pound bomb, or it could carry two 500-pound bombs on each wing instead, or it could carry around a dozen 100-pound bombs, little clusters. So this was a torpedo bomber, meaning it would come in low, flying slow and steady and level, and then it would drop its torpedo, and that would cruise towards the target and hopefully poke a big hole in the side of the ship. To that end, we do have quite a big wing. It's about 35 foot long, and the wing is 50 foot wide. So quite a wingspan there on her. This was no speed demon. It could get up a little over 200 miles per hour if it was in a hurry, but it really liked to cruise at 150 miles or less. And as you see, it's a single engine with 3 propeller blades. And this, as I said, was very modern. It went into service in 1937. The Navy initially ordered 100 for its carriers, and production would wrap up in 1939 with around 130 produced, including prototypes. And what's really funny, even before World War II kicked off, by 1940, 1941, this plane was already considered obsolete, and many of the actual individual aircrafts were considered to be towards the end of their lives. They hadn't been used in any campaigns. They were just training exercises and such. But it's just amazing how quickly. I mean, it seems like today it takes a couple of years just to get one plane built. I mean, look at the F-35 and everything. I mean, this thing was designed in a year and was already outdated in 5 years. That said, after Pearl Harbor, the Devastator was called upon in the early or the first half of World War II, 1942, to do what it could. It was used to disrupt Japanese shipping. Also, it was fitted out as a glide bomber and used to attack targets on islands and such. These were used at New Guinea. But it was in May of 42, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, a major problem was discovered. It was already known that this plane was slow and vulnerable to fighters of the day like the Zero and even the Oscar. Also, its 2 machine guns were pretty weak sauce, and it had relatively thin armor and light protection for the crew. But the death nail was that this torpedo was discovered to be very faulty. The Mark 13 torpedo was discovered to not always detonate. They would even strike the sides of the hulls and just not detonate. And it was a routine problem. They also had problems with setting the depth and actually having them run. It was a shitty torpedo. That's what I'm getting at. So, when the Battle of Midway happened in June of 42, the Devastator, even though they knew that its primary weapon, the torpedo, was faulty at the best of times, still 41 of these were sent against the Japanese carriers, and only 6 came back, and some of those with damage or injured or killed crew. And that was pretty much it. That wiped out about half the fleet. The other 39 or so that were in various places in the Pacific were immediately pulled out of service, retired. A few TBDs were kept on in the Atlantic in various areas, but not really many, not enough to matter. So the few that were kept on 43 were just used stateside for training or tug duty, and the very last TBD Devastator was sent to the scrap heap in November of 1944. And that was all she wrote, folks. There aren't really any in the world today, at least not that weren't recovered from the bottom of the ocean. But after World War II, they didn't keep any of these in the museum. I mean, you know, with only 130 made total, it wasn't exactly a major player in a war where you had thousands upon thousands of planes made. You know, it's just a very brief footnote, just one of those stepping stones. And that's actually why this model is not a Hobbymaster. This is from SkyMax, which was kind of owned by the same people as Hobbymaster, but SkyMax was meant to do A, cheaper planes, and B, kind of more obscure, quirky planes, you know? And so they did the Devastator here some time ago. I don't think they still do it. But it's a neat model. It has kind of nice texturing on the wings. It does have a removable canopy. It doesn't come with crew figures, but you can put them in. The propellers do spin. And we do have the torpedo underneath. And landing gear can be displayed up or down. And this is a 172 diecast. It's actually quite a heavy model for what it is. My only really ding against SkyMax and why I'm being a little gingerly here is this stand. It's kind of got a Y-shaped base and they're a little bit unstable. It's just kind of how they are. But yeah, a very interesting piece of U.S. history, if not necessarily terribly influential. But let's move on to something of more historical note. Moving on, we come to the Scout Bomber Douglas, the SBD, known as the Dauntless. This is not a torpedo bomber, rather, this is a dive bomber, still carrier based. It's a little smaller and faster design with a bit of a different mission profile and a much more successful design. This dates back to 1935 when the idea for a naval-based bomber happened at Northrop, known as the BT, eventually BT-1. Well, in 1937, Douglas took over Northrop and integrated them, kept the project, and this led to the update to the BT-2, which eventually evolved into the SBD, which was finished out, tested in 1939, first flew in 1940, and both the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines placed orders, and even the U.S. Air Force, or I should say U.S. Army Air Corps at that time, later to be the U.S. Army Air Forces, and then this U.S. Air Force, even placed orders. The Marines were the first to get the SBD in late 1940. They got the SBD-1. Then a few months later, in 41, the Navy would get the SBD-2, which was a longer ranged version, which makes sense since they were thinking more carrier based, whereas the Marines would operate more from land based. And actually the Air Force would end up waiting quite a few years for its planes. It would designate this as the A-24 Banshee, and it would really only have a handful early on in 1941. what do we have here? Well, we are a smaller plane. We're at about 33 foot long. We have a wingspan of about 41 and some change feet. We have a crew of 2, pilot and gunner. Defensive armaments include 2 .50 caliber Browning type machine guns in the front and in the fuselage. In the back, we have 2 .30 caliber machine guns, so basically double that of the Devastator. Like I said, this is a dive bomber. It can carry up to about a 2,000-pound bomb, or it can carry clusters of other smaller bombs. You basically fly up high and then dive, and the flaps and the wings were specially made so it could dive down. And this would allow it to give more or less pinpoint accuracy, at least what pinpoint accuracy would be for World War II, hitting point targets. It was relatively fast. It could cruise at 185 miles per hour. And it could get up past 250 miles if it really needed to. So quite a bit faster than the Devastator, but a different role, different design, smaller, lighter plane. And speaking of that, it was actually small enough and light enough it could be used as a decently effective dogfighter. It had a decent kill ratio in the war. Some of these were in the air during Pearl Harbor and did do what they could do during that time. Then just a few days later, SBDs would sink a Japanese submarine, and then they would be used quite heavily to attack Japanese targets on various islands in the first half of 1942. And as you probably know, this plane's really claim to fame happened during the Battle of Midway in June of 42, when the SBDs played a major role in sinking 3 to 4 Japanese carriers and a couple of heavy cruisers and sundry other smaller vessels. Afterwards, they would continue to be used. For example, they were used during the Guadalcanal campaign in 42. They would, of course, introduce improved versions. The SBD-3 would have self-sealing fuel tanks, more armor. It would introduce the 4 machine gun arrangement we already mentioned. The SBD-5 would be the most produced version, and it had an upgraded, more powerful engine, and more bullets. It had more ammunition. So this was the most common version. In total, they would produce over 5,900 Dauntlesses. The last one rolled out of the factory in late July of 1944. The Navy would kind of start replacing these by a newer plane in 44, and their last major engagement was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in the summer of 44. Pretty much after that, the SBD was removed from frontline service. It was really a popular plane with pilots. They liked how maneuverable it was, how rugged, dependable. Its nickname was Slow But Deadly, because it wasn't the fastest thing around, but it got the job done. And I think a lot of pilots liked it just for how it handled, how maneuverable it was. And it said that this meant it was easier to land on carriers too. This would not just be used exclusively in the Pacific, no. In November of 42, SBDs would be used in Operation Torch during the invasion of North Africa by the Allies. And then in the next year, they would start to be deployed over and around Europe, harassing German Nazi shipping and warships and U-boats and such. Well, the Navy would retire theirs out in 44. The Marines would keep using them to the end of the war. The Air Force would acquire some, but really didn't have much good to say about them. They thought they were too lightly armed, too slow. They just didn't like them. So the A-24 Banshee didn't really get much of anything. They had a few versions, the 24A, the 24B. 24B was basically the SBD-5, so it had a more powerful engine, therefore it was a little faster. So they liked to be a little more. That said, they were kept kind of in second-line roles in the Air Force. But ironically, when the Air Force spun off from the Army in 47, they would still have some Dauntlesses. And since they were dropping the A designation, A-24, these would be renamed as the F-24 Banshee, the few that were still in service. But the rest of the fleet would be retired in 1950 and basically scrapped. And there you have it. That's kind of a rundown of this. This is a Hobby Master model, but it's one of their early ones. It's a very chunky feeling. It does have a removable canopy. I don't know if the crew figure is removable though. He came already installed, so I don't know if he can be pulled out. I haven't tried. Probably won't. And the bomb is kind of permanently there too. But it is there. It's kind of semi-recessed into the fuselage. That's just how they did on the Dauntless. Neat plane, and a very important part of American air power in the Pacific early on in the war, and even through 44, as I said. So, and even when it was replaced, some pilots and sailors and everyone else kind of lamented its passing and still thought it was better. Kind of funny that. But yeah. Well, that gets us to the first wave. In video 2, we'll get to the second, so check back in for that very soon. This is Misha, and I'll catch you then. But if you have any questions or comments in the meanwhile, please feel free to post them below. If not, I'll catch you next time.